the rest of Europe. And then in the second half, we're going to move on to more worldwide perspective. And then we'll have the opportunity for conversation with our speakers at the end of each half. I'll say a bit about how we're going to do that in a minute. So first part then, we're very fortunate to have Fabian Zuleeg, Chief Executive, Chief Economist of the European Policy Centre, and Charles Abbott and Matt Broadbent from Scotland, Europa, to give us the European perspective. And then in the second half, David Skilling of the Landfall Strategy Group, who was part of his background is he was providing some input to the Scottish Government's Economic Recovery Group report, which was published recently. But he's worked in a number of places all over the world and will be able to give us a perspective from that angle. And then we'll have a discussion with David, and then we'll aim to close at around 11:15. So just in terms of engaging, the next slide, Alison, if you could, please. So when we get to the discussion stages, you can either use the chat box to record a question, and if you put the question in the chat box, I'll do my best to ask it on your behalf, or you can use the raise hand function in the participants box, which should show me a little blue hand in my box here, and I'll be able to invite you to say what you want to say in person. We've also got social media as well, so for any of you tweeting and any difficulties, feel free to email Alison at EDAS. Alison and Elaine are doing all the work behind the scenes to keep this running this morning. So anyway, that's enough by way of introduction, I think. Why don't we kick off and I'll invite Fabian to start us off this morning to begin looking at the perspective from Europe. Fabian.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. Just to say that we have also been doing some work on the particular Scottish perspective on all of this. Together with Alison Hunter, we started a series of papers pre-COVID, Scotland's Economic Future, Disruptive Ideas. And we are now working with the contributors to adapt that to the post-COVID world. And we are hoping to also engage with you on that. So maybe I'll come back later on also on comments on what that might imply for Scotland. But what I want to focus on in the first part is really the question of what kind of crisis are we facing? What kind of responses are we seeing to that crisis, and what could that mean for the future? And I think it is important to start with a statement which I think should be obvious by now, but there is still some discussion, and certainly in political circles, it's not necessarily recognized as such. This is a structural crisis. It is not a temporary downturn. This will have long-lasting impacts, which will change some of the underlying relationships between economic variables, between how policy and economics interact. It will change societies in quite a fundamental way. And that implies that the first step we have to do is to really understand this crisis, to really start to get to grips with this. And I'm saying that with all the humbleness of saying we're just at the beginning of this. So the uncertainty is enormous. We don't know what is going to happen. We don't know what shape the next step in this crisis is going to take. We don't even know whether the first phase of the crisis, the health part, is actually over, or whether we're still in a situation where that continues, or hopefully not, but it might even re-emerge. So that's something I think we need to bear in mind. But I think we can also see that there are some fundamental shifts which will have a big impact on economic development around the world. And I'm just going to go through these very quickly because there's limited time, but I'm happy to come back to all of those in the discussion. One is that we will have a significant amount of excess capacity in a number of different sectors. And that is global cross-border excess capacity. So it will mean that there will not be the demand. The demand will not come back at the same level to sustain the same level of economic activity. And that, of course, has a distributional impact. Different parts are more dependent on certain sectors than others. I mean, the obvious example here is tourism. Tourism is not likely to go back to the same levels as it was before. But there's also distributional issues across countries. And that is another aspect of this crisis. It has very large distributional effects. There are some places which will be more resilient, but there are also other places which are very vulnerable to this crisis. And this is starting to play out also at the global level. This also means that when we look at some developing countries, some of the developments, when you look at South Africa, South America, it is extremely worrying if you look at the numbers of COVID cases and what impact that might have on the longer term development of these places. And of course, the global environment also has other influence. We have a global environment which even before the crisis was challenging for Europe, in particular, the loss of the United States as the stalwart of the global economic system, the threat of trade wars, the threat of conflict between China and the US. And the COVID crisis enforces that. It re-enhances this situation where countries all around the world are going to think more in terms of my country first. And this is a paradox, because I think what the crisis has shown is it is much harder to deal with the impacts of these crises if you try to do it only at the national level. But the instinct, and in many populations, the instinct is that we actually have a focus on your own people. Now, there is an exception to that, and as a continued convinced European, I think it is worth highlighting that the European Union has been exceptional. It is the one place around the world where cross-border cooperation has continued to happen. Not always as fast as it should, not always to the extent that it should, but it is remarkable what has actually happened. And it shows how much we are actually used to the European Union, that we simply expect that to be the case, that there is not actually a question that the European Union has to act together on that. And I'll come back to that in a little bit. But this is very important also because what the crisis is creating is in some ways big government. I'm using that as a very broad term to cover a whole load of interventions, but clearly government, public spending, state aid is back with a vengeance. This is, again, not a temporary feature. We are talking about a world in which governments will be deeply involved in economic development, in the private sector. We're seeing in a number of countries that state aid levels are remarkably high. In the European Union, we have the additional challenge that one of the countries, Germany, is spending over 50% of the whole state aid within the European Union. So again, this will have distributional impact. It has an impact on the level playing field within the European Union. But governments are taking stakes. They are becoming equity holders in certain companies. In some companies, there's a big question about what is the long-term trajectory. I would say with many of the initiatives we have seen at the beginning of this crisis, they were there to prevent essentially two things from happening. One is a collapse in employment. So we have many furlough schemes in a variety of different ways. and the other is an attempt to prevent companies to collapse under the burden of accumulated liabilities, which have amassed during the lockdown in particular. But these are not long-term policies. They are short-term policies which can help bridge for a certain period. But the question is, what happens once you reach that period and the world has changed? Yes, if we were to go back to a pre-COVID-19 world, which looks very similar, which has the same kind of employment patterns, the same kind of company pattern, then this would make sense. But if we're going back to a very different world, if we're going forward to a very different world, then these schemes will have a problem, because they also create a lock-in, they create an expectation. At what point in time will you stop providing the support? If demand doesn't recover, if these companies are not viable in the longer term, at least not in the shape they are in. If you take an example like the airline industry, where the German state is spending 9 billion on Lufthansa, can we really imagine a situation that in a year's time the German state says, well, we have to write off those 9 billion and we're going to let Lufthansa go bankrupt now? So these are the kind of challenges we're going to get into. It's a form of lock-in. We have a number of challenges which also will feed into democracy, which will feed into our political systems. Economic crisis always has a political effect as well. In this case, at the initial outset, it doesn't look like the populists, which very often happen to be Eurosceptics as well, are gaining very much. In some countries, there might even be a hope that they might lose from this. If we're looking at the United States, Trump seems to be very much challenged at the moment. But I would question whether that is going to be the long term. In the long term, the populists will come back. They will offer easy solutions. I think we have seen some of that kind of debate already when it comes to exiting the lockdown, with a lot of pressure to do things faster, in some cases faster than is sensible. So we will have, I think, that political challenge as well, which will lead to governments reacting in different ways. Finally, and this is the bit which I think is still extremely uncertain, I apologize for the overuse of the term, but it's the new normal. What does the new normal actually look like? Are we going to travel significantly less? Are we going to have, just to look at one area, if you look at transport, we might have a tendency towards a greater use of biking or walking of short term, but at the same time, we might also have a great threat to public transport. We might have a situation where people will simply not feel comfortable about going back into public transport. And if you play that through in many, many different areas, we're talking about societal change, and that will have a huge impact on the way economic development can function, the way certain activities will take place. Just to give one example, are we going to have the same movement of international students as we had before the crisis? Are we going back to those numbers, or are we going to have to find significantly different methods of delivering higher education? And what does that do to business models? What does that do to the way the universities function at the moment? And that means for policy making, we actually have to be far more focused on risk, on uncertainty, on managing different expectations, of building contingencies, being able to react fast and at scale at different problems. What matters also is the frameworks in which we operate. Do they give us security? Do they give us the background which was needed? So that brings me to the European response, and I will be brief, but I can come back to that. But on the European response, I think we have, at the European level, struggled with these uncertainties. We have struggled also to react as quickly as we should have at the beginning of the crisis. But I would also note that when we look at the Euro crisis, our last experience, it took a year and a half before we actually had a response to the first phase of the Euro crisis. This time around, we're talking about months. We're talking about things already being in place. So in many ways, when it comes to the economic response, there was a rather fast response. We are now going to have the discussions at the middle of this month of the next multi-annual financial framework, the EU budget, and the recovery program. And I'm rather confident that we will come to a compromise. It's not going to be exactly what anyone wants. That is the nature of the European compromise. But it is actually a remarkable departure from where Europe has been up to now. It encapsulates things which were unthinkable pre-COVID. Just to give one example, we will have a European Union which borrows to spend through grants and loans on some of the weaker member states. That is something which would never have happened. And we're talking about a very significant scale of this response happening. There will continue to be discussions also on other consequences of this crisis. For example, there will be a greater emphasis on, and you can use different buzzwords, strategic autonomy, technological sovereignty, whatever we might want to put around that. But there will be more of a focus on seeing what are the kind of activities which the European Union feels have to take place within Europe. Certainly in the health sector, there will be a rethink, and that will also be a rethink in terms of European health policy. One of the big challenges in this crisis was that essentially the European Union doesn't really have competences in the health sector. So it could do very little unless it concerned the single market where it has competences. So in my opinion, we will actually see a de facto shift of competences in the health sector to the European level, not with a treaty change, but with a decision to jointly do things which were done separately beforehand. So overall, what does all this mean? I think what we are going to see at the European level is more cooperation. We are going to see more solidarity, more cooperation, more working together. Is that going to be enough? I think given the nature of the crisis I've tried to describe, it will not be enough. It is a first step. It is the beginning of what the European Union has to do. But there, I would say the European Union is in the same boat as everyone else. This is the start of a process where we will all have to refocus on this crisis. This is a transition of a lifetime, and it is a transition which needs to take place at the same time as the sustainability transition, at the same time as the technology transition. So it is an enormous challenge, but in some ways it is also an opportunity. It is a way of changing some things permanently. I think many people, including myself, have been surprised what is actually possible in terms of technologies, what we can do with the methods which have been there, but have not been taken up as widely as they could be. And now I think many organizations, including my own, are thinking about what of this will be permanent. How do we actually change our business model more fundamentally over time? And that, I think, is an opportunity, but I can't as an economist, I can't stop without putting a warning on that. But that also means that if you're left behind in this, you will lose out, because in that global environment, which I was just describing, I think the tendency towards winner takes all will be even stronger. I'll leave it at that, but I'm very happy to come back to any of that in the discussion.
Okay, great. Thanks, Fabian. An opportunity, but with some very big strings attached, though, as well. Yes. Okay. Well, before we move on to questions and discussion, let's hear from Charles Abbott and Matt Broadbent from Scotland Europa to get their perspective on things. Over to you.
Thanks, Charlie. I'm just going to share my screen with you very briefly. Can you let me know if you see that?
No, not at the moment. Oh yes, here we go. Yeah.
Excellent. So I just want to bring up a slide in the background. I'll say a couple of words about who we are in Scotland Europa first, for those of you who are potentially not quite so familiar with us. So we are based in Scotland House, Brussels, and we're a membership organisation which represents Scotland's interests across the institutions, regions, member states of the European Union. We're a membership organisation which brings together a number of universities, a number of kind of third sector organisations, but particularly that kind of economic development community in Scotland. And we're also the Office of Scottish Enterprise in Brussels, so we're very kind of tightly wedded into Scottish Enterprise back in Scotland, and we also work very closely with Highlands and Islands Enterprise and other economic development actors in Scotland. In Scotland House Brussels, we kind of form one part of Scotland's representation in Europe, and of course we work very closely with our Scottish Government colleagues here in Brussels as well as with Scottish Development International in Scotland House Brussels, and that's really Scotland's kind of diplomatic, economic and cultural kind of heart in Scotland. So between us all, between ourselves and our government colleagues, we're very much operating in this, I suppose, as Fabian has described it, this kind of continuing kind of period of certain uncertainty at the moment. And I'd like to just, I suppose, touch on a couple of points which Fabian has kind of very elegantly kind of brought up there around the kind of the nature of the crisis we're in, part of the European response, and also how we're working to hopefully kind of represent Scotland's economic development interests, especially. And it's a pleasure to be able to do this jointly with EDAS this morning, and to kind of reach out to the wider economic development community in Scotland as well. So I think, as Fabian said, there's quite a huge focus, of course, around the world, in Europe and back home, on exiting the immediate crisis. As Fabian said, there's a huge amount of very uncertain variables in how we exit the current crisis, which equally applies to the EU as much as it does to Scotland too. But I think there are some interesting trends which are starting to emerge in terms of that kind of focus on cross-border cooperation. And Fabian also mentioned this notion of strategic autonomy at the EU level in terms of kind of technological sovereignty. And so there are some quite high level kind of policy debates going on in Europe, especially around how we manage those kind of multiple kind of transitions, be that especially the sustainability transition, the transition towards kind of more inclusive and more well-being economies as well. So I suppose, that conversation around the COVID-19 recovery, is very much part and parcel of that conversation around, what next for Europe, as Fabian has mentioned. And I suppose the additional complexity for Scotland navigating in this landscape right now is, we are in a position where we are in the process of transitioning out of the European Union into a potentially different, slightly unknown framework. And, so we're kind of operating in a kind of very ever-shifting environment right now. One of the key priorities for us amidst all this kind of uncertainty is to make sure, we're working as closely as possible with, our counterparts in Scotland, but equally with our counterparts at the European level as well, to ensure that we're still playing a constructive role in the discussions around European kind of policy, whether it's kind of policy regarding exiting the crisis, or whether it's kind of more sectoral policies around, say, the net zero transition, or one of our other key areas, which is making sure that research and innovation is a kind of an underpinning and driving force to help us kind of exit this crisis as well. So amidst all that kind of uncertainty and amidst all that kind of backdrop, we are very much still engaging with our kind of European partners at the current time. And I want to just say a couple of words about how we're doing that. I suppose one of the strengths we've been trying to kind of emphasize to our European partners at the moment is the kind of way we're tackling the response in Scotland. So that's the National Action Plan. Of course, you'll be aware of the advisory group's kind of report at the beginning of last week as well. But also the way Scotland is actually looking at tackling this crisis through that kind of collaborative effort domestically, and thinking about how our agencies are collaborating incredibly closely with each other domestically. I think that is also something we're trying to emphasize and kind of really bed into how we're actually working with our kind of international and European partners at the moment as well. What I wanted to touch on is a few of the kind of the key European networks which we're working with right now in order to make sure that, despite all the other kind of uncertainties at the moment, we're still very much at the table and keeping, all our channels of communication open, but more importantly, keeping the doors open with partners whom we've worked with for a great number of years. So Matt will go into, I think, a couple more details around some of the work he's been doing in the kind of tourism field, etc. But I just wanted to highlight, a couple of our key networks we work with, which you can see them on the slide. I thought better to put them on the slide rather than just bombard people with acronyms at this time in the morning. Two in particular I'd like to highlight is the Vanguard Initiative for new growth through smart specialization, as well as the ERIN network, which is the European Regions Research and Innovation Network. We engage in a number of networks across Brussels. We're very highly present in that kind of Brussels ecosystem you can see on the picture there, and we like to kind of work very closely with our kind of government colleagues to make sure we're kind of touching as many bases as possible in terms of the various kind of actors in Brussels. The reason why I'd like to single out in particular the kind of the Vanguard Initiative and ERIN at this point in time, the Vanguard Initiative is a network of around 30 regions, which is very engaged in cooperating along the principles of smart specialization in order to create new kind of value chains at the European level. And I think this is just one example of how Scotland, is really continuing to engage very strongly at the current period of time. A huge, quite a big topic is, around these issues of, strengthening Europe's strategic autonomy, and as I've mentioned, and kind of technological sovereignty. And one thing which the European Commission proposed slightly earlier this year was a brand new industrial strategy for Europe, very much in the context of the kind of the European Green Deal, which can be seen as the kind of the big kind of net zero transition, as well as the kind of the new economic growth strategy, I suppose, for Europe in the decade ahead, really. And through networks like Vanguard, we can very much still be engaged in the discussion about how kind of European regions and kind of non-member state or subnational entities can still be very much engaged in actually driving the ambitions of Europe's industrial policy. So Scottish Enterprise is very much engaged in this discussion from a Vanguard Initiative perspective. We had our Director of Strategy at Scottish Enterprise, Linda Murray, at a high-level meeting last week, virtual high-level meeting last week, to discuss Scotland's response to the economic crisis, really emphasising the role of SMEs in that process at the moment. And it's just one example of how we're trying to really kind of keep doors open with key regions around those areas which matter most to us as well. The ERIN network is also one I'd just like to touch on briefly. It's a network of around 130 regions with research and innovation kind of competences. We've been a founder member of the ERIN network since about 2006, and it's been an incredible vehicle to make sure we're kind of still very much at the table in terms of shaping the overall kind of European Union's research and innovation kind of policy as well. And ERIN is now quite a respected actor in that discussion. And given the focus of especially the kind of incoming German EU presidency at the moment on thinking about how research, education, and innovation are absolutely critical in terms of kind of underpinning the response to the recovery at the moment. The fact that we're still very engaged in these networks, and these are key players around the table, is still it's still a very important way of how we try to continue to make sure that Scotland's voice is heard and considered in the European debate. I'll pass over to Matt to kind of continue there, but happy to pick up any of this in the discussion.
Okay, thank you, Charles. Over to you, Matt.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Charlie. Hopefully you can all hear me okay. Well, firstly, thanks a lot for inviting us to kind of speak at this. It's a really interesting opportunity for ourselves and our members to kind of have a bit more of a conversation about where we see ourselves in the current situation and going forward vis-a-vis our kind of relationship with those European networks, but also those counterparts that we have within those networks as well. I was going to touch upon just a little bit today a couple of the kind of really key examples of cooperation, collaboration we have with our kind of those strategic networks within Europe. More specifically being around tourism, as Fabian and Charles both mentioned just a moment ago. So I guess over the last period, what we've seen is a real kind of important opportunity and need for us to kind of be delivering a little bit more the kind of the Scotland perspective of how we're approaching this this crisis, how we're bringing together development actors, and how we're kind of actually delivering to make sure that we can still fulfill all the commitments that we've been talking about, such as inclusive growth, such as the net zero transition, everything like that, but make sure that we adapt to the current situation that we're in. And I think, as it's been kind of mentioned already, one real kind of point that stands out from Scotland is the kind of this joined up approach that we're taking on the economic development front, to bringing together agencies, to bringing together those kind of key actors, to kind of have that more informed, that more holistic approach to the kind of response. And that's one thing that we've been really keen to emphasize to our European counterparts in those networks, but that's also one thing that our counterparts have been really interested to hear about from us as well. So I understand, I think it was your last COVID conversation, you had that conversation with Ewan around some of the kind of future scenarios work that Scottish Enterprise and the government are doing, but also alongside all of those different organisations that are really key in not just kind of contributing to the discussion around how we shape that, but also around actually delivering further down the line as well. This is kind of collaborative, joined up work that our European counterparts have been really keen to hear about. So another example is one network that you'll kind of see on the screen is the EURADA network. So that's the European Association of Development Agencies. This is a network that Scottish Enterprise and HI have been in for kind of quite a long time, been very active members of. But also what we've sought to do is bring that kind of holistic perspective, that joined up approach that we're seeing in Scotland, and feeding to for kind of the last few months been seeking to bring together the development agencies across Europe to have that conversation about, you know, how do we respond to the challenges that SMEs are facing? How do we respond within the really specific sectors such as tourism, such as innovation? And I think that message of joined up collaborative work in Scotland is something that's really resonating with members within that particular network. But I think within the kind of inclusive growth field, one area I've been working on particularly closely over the last few months has been the kind of field of tourism. So obviously, this is a conversation that's particularly important, particularly relevant in Scotland, not just about the tourism sector and industry as a whole, but also what kind of tourism do we want. So this talk about a need to switch to a sustainable tourism sector. So this is a conversation we've been having for a few years in Scotland, but this is a conversation that more and more we're seeing the counterparts across Europe starting to have now. And I think inevitably, as Fabian touched upon, this is a conversation that's going to continue, and actually one that can no longer be avoided, to the extent where we're going to have to be talking about where does the tourism sector and the industry go from here. So one particular example we've been working on more specifically with Visit Scotland recently, but with all kinds of different actors from Scotland, kind of across the piece in industry, and just the sector more broadly, has been around this, how do we look to shape the tourism sector for the future? And two kind of key networks through which we've done that has been Next Tour. So that is a network of European regions for sustainable tourism, and also the ERIN network that Charlie mentioned, with much more of a focus on research and innovation. So over the last kind of few months, a number of kind of our colleagues from back in Scotland have been contributing to these kind of discussions. One example in the ERIN network was a kind of broader discussion on what the immediate response in the tourism sector looks like, how do we deliver that in the future, and what needs to change to be able to deliver that. And this was a conversation that we had with Slovenian colleagues, Spanish colleagues, and Portuguese colleagues from, I think, Alentejo and the Canary Islands, to kind of name a few. And these are conversations that are now actually, they've been, I suppose, a little bit more established through the kind of crisis that we're in. But also these are conversations that are going to have to continue and develop way beyond this as we start to look at what the tourism sector looks like for the future. But one kind of point we've been really kind of keen to emphasise, not just to the Scotland Europa members, but kind of across the board in the tourism field, has been that there are so many different actors in this field that are delivering on so many different things. So one conversation could be around skills development and a look at how we kind of seek to update the skills of tourism workers as the sector changes. Another one could be around community development. So how do we make sure that communities across Scotland are continuing to see the benefits of tourism, and that's done so in a sustainable way? And I think that's one thing that's going to kind of keep coming back as a real key focal point over the next coming months and years, inevitably. So what we kind of say to you is, you know, these are all conversations that we're having with our European counterparts. These are all conversations that our European counterparts are also having among ourselves, and across the board within the kind of the Scotland Europa and the Scotland House Brussels team, alongside our government and SDI colleagues. We're really keen to kind of share the experience that you've had, and the kind of share the input that you have to develop not just a kind of more sustainable and more sort of future-proof approach across the board to respond to this crisis, but to develop something that also kind of inherently benefits Scottish stakeholders as well. So I guess I'll leave it there, and please kind of feel free to let us know if you've got any questions.
Okay, good. We've got a few things been coming up in the chat box. I think in time-honoured fashion, I'm going to actually adjust things slightly. I think probably better to have, rather than get a discussion going now and then have to cut it off to go to David. I think it should be a good idea to take David's input and then have the discussion at the end if everybody's happy with that. David, do you want to make your contribution now? That would be smashing. Thank you.
Sure, happy to do that. So thank you and good morning from the Netherlands. So the reason I think I'm here to talk to you today is I recently contributed to the report that Benny Higgins led in terms of providing advice into the Scottish Government on a structural response to COVID. And so what I'd like to do is to talk through the nature of my contribution and the perspectives that I provided, drawing very much on the international small economy experience. Scotland is not a fully autonomous country, clearly, but I think there's much that Scotland can learn from the experience of small advanced economies around the world. And so there are several points that I would like to make, again, drawing on the contribution that I made. First, just offering some perspectives on the nature of the small economy exposure to COVID. Clearly it is a very significant both public health event, but also economic event. For the most part, small economies have done actually a pretty good job in controlling the spread of COVID, certainly compared to some of the larger economies. So my home country, New Zealand, eliminated COVID, at least domestic cases of COVID, a couple of weeks back. Many small economies in Asia, from Taiwan, Hong Kong, and the like, have done similarly, and also within Europe. Many of the better performer economies in terms of controlling COVID have been the smaller ones, the Nordics, Switzerland, and so on. So in a sense, that's good news, and these economies, including some larger ones, are beginning to open up now. In the UK context, of course, the UK overall hasn't been a very good performer. Scotland has done much better than the full UK, and I guess that's a response partly to the more cautious and to an extent more aggressive measures that the Scottish government have imposed. So Scotland, in a sense, is performing not unlike small economies around the world in terms of the COVID numbers. But that unfortunately doesn't give small economies a particular edge as they think about the economic recovery process going forward. It turns out that many small economies, although they are, if you like, ahead of a pack in terms of being able to reopen their domestic economies for business, have a fairly ugly economic outlook. So here, if you look at economic forecasts, most recently from the OECD, but also from the IMF, from the European Commission, in addition to countries like Italy and Spain that have had a pretty awful experience, you see many small economies clustered towards the bottom of those rankings, notwithstanding the very strong performance in terms of controlling COVID. And that reflects the reality that small economies are deeply exposed to the strength of the global economy beyond their borders. Exports, be it tourism or exports of merchandise trade, are a very significant growth driver of these small economies. And to the extent that the regional and global economy is going to remain sluggish for a period of time, and I think a sustained period of time, that is not good news for small economies. So again, it's a reminder that you can do many good things domestically, but you still have a residual exposure to what happens beyond your borders. So I think as Scotland sort of looks to the future, its fortunes are very much tied to state, obviously, the broader UK, but also the regional and global economy beyond. And I think to echo the points that Fabian made in his remarks, this is not going to be a short, sharp shock. This by no means is going to be a V-shaped recovery as we saw during the global financial crisis. If you look at the global spread of COVID, it is still ongoing, particularly in the US, but also importantly, I think, in many developed countries around the world, the numbers are increasing every day. And that is going to act as a real constraint, a real drag on the global economic recovery. So we need to expect an ongoing period of very sluggish external demand. I suppose that's true for Scotland as it is for other small economies. So that's observation one, is that small economies have done well, but they are deeply exposed economically. Now, the second point is that this is not simply sort of a 2 or 3 year journey, again, to echo the points that Fabian made. COVID is accelerating and strengthening a range of structural dynamics that have been at work for many years and are going to lead to quite a different global economy in 5-10 years' time than we had going into this. There are a few dimensions, and clearly there's lots of uncertainty. Clearly you can cut these dynamics in many different ways, but there are 3 dynamics that I think are particularly useful to think about. The first is around globalization and geopolitics, so shifts in the global economic and political order. Globalization, has been flatlining over the last decade. If you look at export shares to global GDP and the like, after 20, 25 years of very strong growth in globalization, the last 10 years has been a flat line, essentially. And the outlook going forward, I think, is deeply uncertain with some real negative risk. You have a reshoring of supply chains, increasing political frictions with countries wanting to establish their own sort of national champions, to close borders, to constrain supply chains, and so on and so on. So, for small countries that are deeply exposed to globalization, to an open rules-based system, I think there are some real red flags that are beginning to go up. Not new, but I think will be strengthened. That is going to be reinforced, if you like, by growing geopolitical tensions. And I think a very real risk that the global system begins to fragment into competing blocs. Europe, and then we're looking US, and a China-dominated Asia, to put it bluntly. So much more multipolar set of arrangements than we've seen previously, with real frictions between those competing blocs. There is growing pushback, to take one example, on China. The recent events in Hong Kong, the way that China has conducted itself in terms of transparency around COVID and the like. You'll begin to see, after sort of many years of sort of accepting the rise of China, a much more concerted pushback. Now, you can argue the rights and wrongs of that, but that will have, I think, an enduring economic impact as well as political. Secondly, there is going to be a growing role of the state. Both from the short term, the various stimulus packages that we have seen, the need for bailouts of various strategically important firms. But I think underlying that, there is a sense that norms and the consensus around what the appropriate role of the state is are shifting. That's been underway for some time, and I think COVID has kind of catalyzed that. So we should expect a much more, I think, expansive role of the state, based on, I think, shifting public sort of views or preferences around what the government should or should not be doing. So I think in terms of metrics like government spending, but also in terms of the government balance sheet more broadly, what the government owns or doesn't own, as well as various regulatory interventions in terms of sort of how the government interacts with real economy. I think on many of those dimensions, the role of the state is shifting. The flip side of that is, if the government is going to be much more involved in economic and other matters, then issues of state capability, institutional quality, the quality of policy making matter much more. If you are in a minimal state model, then how good the government is doesn't matter as much. If the government is absorbing a greater and greater share of GDP and getting more hands-on in the real economy, clearly the quality with which it discharges those functions becomes much more important. And the third vector of change, a bit of a grab bag, but it speaks to shifting business models, technology, shifting consumer preferences. All of these things are going to lead to quite different ways in which business is conducted. So to take some obvious examples, a shift from physical to digital or virtual. So less physical retail, for example, to more online, much more working from home. And so we can expect to see kind of more capital intensive, more technology intensive, more virtual modes of doing business, less cross-border movements of people, which will mean that businesses have to organize their functions in quite different ways. And that will lead to winners and losers in terms of business models, in terms of sectors. In many cases, these trends have been underway for some time. These technologies are not new. But if you look at the performance of everyone from Zoom to Microsoft and so on over the last 2-3 months, they are seeing a much greater speed of digitalizing functions than they had expected pre-COVID. So these are structural dynamics. Now, the interesting part of it, I suppose, is how are governments, how are economies beginning to respond to these challenges and opportunities, both near term, the shock of the crisis, but particularly the structural dynamics that are underway. And this is, I think, where the report that Benny Higgins led was particularly focused. Yes, we understand there's a short-term set of challenges to which we need to respond, and that, for the most part, to put it bluntly, involves governments throwing lots and lots of money at the problem, and I think doing so, for the most part, reasonably effectively. But we've also got to realize that this is a marathon, not a sprint. If we spend all of our money addressing the short-term challenges, acute though they are we doing ourselves a disservice in terms of not positioning ourselves to positioning ourselves for the future? And frankly, will we also begin to run out of money and resource to deal with some of these structural challenges? And so as I look around the world at what are the common themes that are beginning to define the nature of policy responses, again, particularly in small economies, but not exclusively. there are a few, to me at least, common themes beginning to reveal themselves as governments around the world begin to rotate their policy focus from the here and now to a sort of a 3, 5, 10-year horizon. So for convenience, I've structured these around 3 kind of classes of debate and in some cases policy action. The first is sectoral. So there is a sense, and Fabian I think also touched on this, that there are going to be sectoral winners and losers coming out of this. Some of these structural dynamics around globalization, these new business models will affect some sectors positively and others negatively. So again, to use some, I guess, reasonably obvious examples, international tourism, I think is going to be a loser from COVID, very obviously in the short term because borders are closed, but also I think in a longer term sense, the increased frictions, the financial difficulties in the aviation sector, already shifting consumer preferences around long-haul travel, bearing in mind that one of the themes last year was around flight shaming, people becoming increasingly concerned about the emissions profile of long-haul travel. All of these things, it seems to me, are coming together in a way that we are less likely to see rapid growth in seat capacity for travel. Budget airlines, with a few exceptions, are under stress. Many of the legacy carriers are being bailed out, from Lufthansa to Air France KLM. And if you listen to the CEOs of many of these airlines, be it Qatar or KLM, they are saying it's going to take us 3, 4, 5 years to get passenger traffic back to where it was last year. So this is a long haul. And even when that happens, the trend rate of growth, I think, is going to be markedly lower. On the flip side, you have sectors like pharmaceuticals, like digital technology, that have done actually pretty well over the last few months, and I think have pretty strong growth prospects going forward because they tap into some of these longer term trends. So if you look at, and these I know are a rough barometer of future outlook, but if you look at the equity indexes, and if you compare life sciences and pharmaceuticals and technology and how they've performed compared to their respective benchmarks in the US and Europe, they've done very, very well. On the flip side, retail, hospitality, and the like have done actually pretty badly. So I think there, for every economy, and Scotland will be no exception to this, there are some structural sectoral winners and losers. So from a policy perspective, yes, it is important to stem the bleeding, to provide short-term support to firms and to households, but we need to do so in a way that is cognizant of some of these structural dynamics at work. You can spend a lot of money trying to prop up sectors that are structurally challenged, and spend much less on trying to support sectors that have better growth prospects. And also, I think this is not simply a fiscal issue. This speaks to skills policy, labour market policy. How do you effectively and quickly manage the very disruptive effects on labour markets? How do you ensure that people who are, for example, in tourism, that may have more subdued growth prospects, how do you upgrade their skills and equip them with an ability to move into other sectors of the economy that might have better growth prospects going forward? How do you manage the very disruptive economic and social dynamics associated with that? And so, you see examples of governments putting in place, significant investments around skills upgrading programs, helping people to kind of re-equip themselves for this new world. So sectoral, I think, is one important dimension. The second is what I call thematic, which is a bit of a grab bag. What are some of the common themes in terms of this kind of new normal that we are likely to encounter, for which we need to position ourselves? And so here you see, certainly a lot of rhetoric at this stage, but rhetoric that I think will over time convert into action, policy action around green. How do we position ourselves for a transition to a lower emissions pathway around digital, for reasons that I've just been mentioning, but also themes around resilience. How do we make sure that we are resilient both in terms of our exposure to external demand, but also on the import side? Are we kind of comfortable that we've got resilience around our supply chains? And so you begin to see governments, particularly in Europe, talking heavily around green and digital, but also in countries like New Zealand, my home country, Singapore. Governments are beginning to put significant sums of money into this transition process. Many of them have already signed up to pretty significant commitments around net zero by 2050 and the like. Governments are looking to spend stimulus money on infrastructure projects to the extent that you are going to do that, doing so in a way that is consistent with your longer term sort of aspiration, if you like, of moving towards a clean, green, digital economy seems to me important. So you are increasingly seeing governments putting these various filters, thematic filters, if you like, over their portfolio of initiatives and sort of spending programs that they are funding. Yes, clearly there's an interest in making sure that these programs are shovel ready, that they're stimulating the economy in the short term, but doing so in a way that moves the economy, that moves livelihoods in a way that you want them to. And then the third dimension, and this I think is particularly important from a small economy perspective, and I'll call it competitiveness for want of a better word. One of the consistent observations of small economies as they respond to crises, be it global financial crisis, SARS, .com, a decade or so previous, and I think now, is that they realize that there are limitations on their ability to rely on demand side measures, running huge fiscal deficits, accumulating significant amounts of debt, relying on loose monetary policy. Now, clearly, small economies, as with many others, are doing all of those things. Deficits in many small economies are moving to unprecedented levels outside of wartime. So this is not to say that we shouldn't do that, as much as small economies have less freedom of movement than do larger economies like the US, like Germany, that can do this to a greater extent. What small economies tend to do stems out of a realization that their prosperity depends in large measure on their ability to compete in global markets. And that is even more so in a period where the strength of demand from those global markets is going to be much reduced and potentially for a sustained period of time. So in that challenging context, it becomes even more important that you need to be distinctive, you need to have a real competitive edge. And so this speaks to a policy agenda around skills, around innovation, and an ability to position your economy, develop strengths in your economy that enable you to compete effectively. And so we're beginning to see a much stronger, I would say, focus on supply side measures coming through in the small country policy response than you see in some larger economies. And I think that will be true in Scotland as well. And so just in closing, bundling all of this together, what does this mean for Scotland? And I think there are, as I said, right at the top of my comments, there are some very striking similarities between Scotland and other small economies, notwithstanding the kind of the constitutional context. For one thing, of course, Scotland is exposed to the global economy in a way not dissimilar to other small economies. So you have to really think hard about what is that profile of external demand going to look like, and what's the environment in which we, Scotland, are going to be operating over the next period of time. And again, my very firm view is that this is a marathon, not a sprint. There is no V-shaped recovery in the offing. We are going to be dealing with a period of very subdued growth for a period of time, as well as these structural challenges. And that it speaks, I think, quite directly to the nature or the shape of a policy response. Scotland's growth model is also going to be challenged, I think, both by reduced external demand, but also by reduced cross-border flows of people. Migration has been an important growth driver for Scotland. Those flows are going to be much reduced, including tourism is going to be much reduced as well. So in terms of the profile, if you like, of growth across sectors, there are going to be, as with many other small economies, some winners and losers. Tourism is going to take a downward leg, whereas sectors in the technology space, perhaps also in food and beverage, I think are a much better position. And so I think, obviously that has a geographic overlay as well. But Scotland, I think, is very exposed to some of these structural dynamics that we see elsewhere. And then I think directly speaks to the kind of policy interventions that are put in place in terms of how you buffer that shock, but also how you provide people, firms, and communities with the assistance they need to transition to a very different demand profile. Similarly, in terms of some of the other things around green, renewable energy, I think, is a real positive for Scotland. And around the world, we see a much greater focus on this, so the ability for Scotland to develop some real sort of leading positions around technology in that space. I think there's real prospects there. And then I think that also begins to speak to the nature of the investments that are made. And then I guess overall, it seems to me that really thinking hard about the salience of some of these supply side measures. Yes, spending programs, the debate around Scotland taking on more debt, those are right and appropriate conversations to have. And I think there is space to be both bold and creative in that space. But that is not a substitute for thinking very hard about the underlying competitive position of the Scottish economy and really focusing again on innovation, R&D, the role of universities in Scotland, which is one of the crown jewels of the Scottish economy, thinking about your position around digital infrastructure, both in the large centres, but also in rural Scotland, which I think is also important. But at the core of this, I think, is really a set of priorities around skills upgrading and ensuring that people are equipped with the skills that they need to perform in an economy that has a different sectoral profile and a different growth profile than has been the case historically. So let me pause there. But I would say, as Scotland thinks about the future in an economic outlook sense, but also as it thinks about the future in terms of policy priorities, you know, it is important to look beyond your borders. There's a lot that other countries are grappling with that is very similar in spirit to the debate in Scotland, and I think there's a lot of policy learnings that can be taken pretty directly. So I hope that's helpful, and very much looking forward to the questions as well. Thank you.
Great, David, thank you very much, and thank you to the other speakers for giving us a really interesting sort of viewpoint, and so many things in there, so many questions and thought, in particular this balance between the short-term cushioning and the longer-term restructuring and investment, and the competitiveness that countries need to strive for, at the same time building collaboration both within and with other places. So let's open it up. We've got 10 minutes or so, but I think I'm perfectly happy to stay on and continue it. But if people need to leave around 11:15, then that's fine. So 2 ways in which to ask questions. One, through the chat box, in which I'll try and interpret them. The other, if you go into your participants box at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a raise hand function. If you raise that hand, then I think it should pop up on my screen, and I will see those questions, those coming up. One that's already come up earlier on, maybe to kick things off, is you mentioned thematic things, David, and the question that came up was the degree to which in Europe and elsewhere people are looking at wider measures of well-being as a sort of metric to help guide policy.
So look, I can offer a couple of points, and Fabian and the others, I'm sure, can offer a point of view on the European dimension. I mean, so my home countries, I think I mentioned, is New Zealand. New Zealand is one of the more advanced countries in terms of formalising reporting on well-being. There's a fairly developed framework and the like. The interesting observation, but I guess I would make, if you look at the packages that have been announced over the last several months in New Zealand, none of them have been based on the well-being framework. Now that partly speaks to the speed and the severity of a crisis and a need just to kind of respond very aggressively without overcomplicating things. But it's difficult, I think, for me to see that there would have been much difference had they done otherwise. You know, and so I think, yes, broader definitions of well-being are important beyond the economic. I would say that's always been the case. Governments have always been concerned to some extent with issues of employment and income distribution and the environment and various other things. So I think sometimes there is a risk that we spend a lot of time over formalizing things that have always been kind of intuitive. Yes, there's always more that can be done around measurement and understanding trade-offs and so on. But I would say, the lion's share of policy focus in the immediate response to the crisis has been around jobs protection, has been around ensuring that people can sustain their livelihoods. Obviously, that's a critically important measure of well-being on any framework. And so I guess, yes, well-being is clearly important. But I would say that's always been the case. Yes, we should do a better job of measuring it, but I'm not sure we would have done anything that different, to be honest, certainly in the immediate crisis response under a well-being framework as opposed to a more kind of conventional policy framework. So certainly the language has changed. I think that's fine and perfectly appropriate. I just wouldn't see it as kind of a complete paradigm shift. We're doing something completely different in a well-being framework than we would have done previously. I'm not sure, Fabian, if you've got any points of view from a European perspective.
Yeah, Fabian, over to you.
I mean, certainly the perspective of well-being, of looking broader, has not gone away. But this is in many ways an emergency situation, and in the emergency situation, I think very clearly the priority for governments and for the European Union has been to protect jobs and to keep businesses alive, which otherwise would have gone under. I think the longer term discussion will be interesting. I think there is a question here, how you make sure that these different objectives are compatible. I mean, that's also a discussion we are going to have when it comes to the Green Deal, when it comes to the sustainability agenda. Are all of the interventions which are being put on the table at the moment in line with that? Do some of them maybe even contradict some of the objectives we have in other areas? And that's something we will have to work through. But in many ways, that's the next step in the crisis response. That's not for now. And I also would be a bit careful about this idea, which I would call benign stagnation, that we already have reached a fairly high level of economic development, so growth is not that important. I think there's 2 points to make to that. One is that so far, at least, I cannot think of any examples where we have managed to decouple the development in the labor market from the development of growth. So if you don't have growth, generally you get more problems in the labor market. And in the current situation, that is a major concern. The second point for me is that when you have growth lower as a managed process, as something where you are trading off in a controlled way between different objectives, that's one thing. What we're talking about here is a massive demand shock. So we're not talking about a controlled process. We're talking about something which will be chaotic and which will lead to a lot of bankruptcies, a lot of negative developments within the economy. So for me, I think growth will have to remain a major focus, also because employment will have to remain a major focus. So the question for me is more, can we manage to have a different kind of growth? Does the growth we have to do with negative impacts on the environment? Or can we, for example, grow much more the digital economy? It's not unproblematic also because the digital sector has a footprint and we also need to take that into account. But certainly there are other ways of growing which are not necessarily just meaning we have to consume more and more resources, more and more material in that process.
Okay, thank you. There's a question here from me and Mara around how important will be trying to look at investment, recovery investment in terms of preventative spend, i.e. preventing problems occurring in the future rather than ameliorating them when they do. Fabian, any thoughts on that before I hand over to David and Charles and Matt?
Sorry, that you were breaking up there, so yeah. I didn't actually hear the question.
How important will investment in things that prevent problems from occurring in the future rather than simply ameliorating the problems? How important will that be in the recovery programs? Did you get that?
Yes, I did hear this time. Thank you. I think it should be very important. I think the question of whether it will be very important, it will depend on what kind of policy priorities we set. And that also depends on the room for maneuver you will have within different governments. I mean, we shouldn't forget that we're not talking about the same capabilities, the same frameworks. Different governments will have very different chances to put an emphasis. I think when you look at Germany with its massive capability also in terms of its fiscal space, it's a very different situation than Greece. So we also have to take that into account. But I think the worrying thing for me would be that we have talked about this shift from reactive to preventative spending in many areas for decades. This is not a new debate. It is something, certainly, for example, in the health sector. We clearly have had that debate for a very long time. And yet, despite having that debate and having a general consensus that it makes sense, it doesn't happen. And we still have woefully low preventative spending. I think there might be one area where I would be a little bit more optimistic because of the hit we have just taken. And that's in the prevention of the spread of future pandemics. I think we are going to see much more action to try to make sure that we have better ways of reacting when the next pandemic hits us, which unfortunately is when rather than if. But I think that's an exception. Whether we will manage the overall shift to have a more rational, forward-looking policy making, will very much depend on individual countries, and I'm a little bit skeptical because we have said it before.
Yeah. Okay, David, for you, you mentioned resilience as one of the thematic things. How important is preventative investment as part of that resilience thing?
Well, and I agree with pretty much everything that Fabian said. It's important. I think everyone understands it's important. Perhaps they understand it a bit more now, particularly in a public health sense, because of the kind of the salience of the recent pandemic. But the political incentives are stacked against it. There's always a more compelling draw on resources and something that might not happen. It might not happen for some time. So I think more will be done. I think there is, the ground has shifted slightly. I would say that there are different dimensions of resilience as well. There's resilience against certain classes of shock, sort of pandemics, public health, and the like. There's also, I think, realization, as we saw with some countries in terms of difficulties sourcing PPE or sort of medicines and the like. I think people are now paying more attention to resilience of supply chains, which is not necessarily a fiscal issue, but it's kind of how do you organize yourself, and are you prepared to pay a little bit more today in order to give yourself an insurance policy for tomorrow. Now, I'd say the other dimension of resilience, and this is particularly true for small economies who are by nature more volatile animals, they get hit by more shocks more often, is the need to maintain a degree of fiscal space. Small countries tend to be more fiscally conservative, more disciplined, partly because they have to be, but also because of an awareness that they do get hit by shocks from time to time, and they will need space to be able to let automatic stabilizers work and to stimulate the economy as need be. So clearly that's a difficult conversation to have at the moment because the demand on resources is so acute, and it is appropriate to be it's like shoveling money out the door to provide support to firms, to workers, to households. But I think as we kind of take the long view, as you think about what the profile of that fiscal trajectory is over the next sort of 5-10 years, bearing in mind that small countries in particular do have some budget constraints that they need to maintain or to sort of respect, and that is one dimension of resilience, the ability to respond fiscally when shocks do occur, as they will, that you have a little bit of money in the cupboard to enable you to respond. If you push things too far to the frontier, then it might be that you end up heavily constrained. Getting that balance right is fiendishly difficult, but I think it is one thing that small economies in Scotland will also need to bear in mind. Okay,
good, thanks. Charles, just thinking on the collaboration theme, I took from what you were saying that the opportunities for collaboration with colleagues across Europe will still exist to a certain extent even though we are no longer a member of the European Union. Am I reaching the right conclusion there?
I think, there's a few things which are dovetailing here at the same time, really. You've got the kind of the COVID response and the recovery plan and, what we have to do to get out of this situation and exactly the consequences that this will have in the longer run. At the Scottish level, coming from a kind of an EU perspective, we're also in that kind of period of defining our relationship within whichever framework we kind of end up with, and to a certain extent, I think the door will very much still be open to us in terms of cooperation. We're at a time where there will be increased interest, I think, from especially kind of similar kind of small economies around Europe in particular, about how we're approaching all of this at the same time, not just the recovery, but thinking about how we're approaching designing a new kind of a regional policy or designing a new kind of rural policy or, innovation policy as well. How are we actually, now that we're kind of, developing a new relationship with Europe, these things where kind of, European structural funds and regional policy have also had a very big bearing on how we've implemented all these things for a long period of time. It will be interesting to other people, I think, looking back at us and saying, how are we doing this over the next few years? And that's where, just to come back on another point, is talking about resilience and also understanding, I suppose, that even in small economies, a shock like this can hit different regions and different places in very different ways. And considering things like the emphasis on the net zero transition and the emphasis, thinking about how different regions of Scotland in particular will kind of react and respond when you've got, a dovetailing of effects and impacts from this crisis all at the same time as kind of wider political challenges. So to cut a long story short, yes, what we're hearing from partners is they're incredibly interested to keep working with us, incredibly interested to avail, for Scotland to be a continued constructive partner in especially a lot of the interregional collaboration activities at the European level. And it's really going to be interesting, the discussion we have in Scotland, thinking about how we can facilitate that.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a positive note, maybe to begin to draw a conclusion. We've run over by about 5 minutes from when we said we would finish. But thank you to all of our speakers for some really stimulating stuff and a hell of a lot to chew on and think about as we try and make sense of what's going on. As Fabian said at the beginning, we're still in a period of massive uncertainty. So even beginning to answer that question of what's going on here is a critical one, and use that as a basis for designing interventions and actions. And we've had a lot of food for thought from all of our speakers this morning. So a very big thank you to them. Very big thank you to everybody for attending today. We have our next conversation on the 14th of August. It's going to be around the theme of enterprise and entrepreneurship. It's going to be led by my colleague Suzanne Hamilton. And we also will have an inclusive growth community of practice event around the wellbeing economy, probably towards the end of July. More information on that as we get it. But let me just conclude there by saying thank you all very much, and thank you to Elaine and Alison for supporting it, to our speakers, to you for attending,